They ask what endures. They study the fractured clay, the frescoes bleached by 3,000 years of sun, searching for the architecture of the soul. But they miss the silence. History, in its grand retelling, always focuses on the structure, never the sweat that corroded the bronze, never the dust settling on the tongue. I tell you now, memory's not a clean script preserved on parchment. It is the phantom pressure of the past gripping the wrist, demanding acknowledgement. And what I remember most vividly is the heat of the earth pressing against the solace of my feet, right before the sky cracked open. We built our world upon the fear of collapse. We were the children of the sea, floating between impossible blue and the constant, trembling threat of the mountain awakening. We adorned ourselves in gold finer than spider silk, yet we worshipped the beast. The bull was not merely an idol or a commodity. It was the raw, unreasoning power that kept the very island tethered to existence. It was the masculine fury that had to be mastered, absorbed, and returned to the Divine Mother, or else we would sink back into the churning Aegean. They record the ritual as a sport, a spectacle of agility. They document the young men and women, the Toreadora, performing their elegant acrobatics over the charging horns. They see the leap, the grab, the inevitable dismount, but they do not feel the weight of the requirement. They do not understand that the leap was not about performance. It was a negotiation with oblivion. It was the only language the earth recognized. I was taught the conventional way. I learned the precise tilt of the spine necessary to ride the momentum, the fraction of a second when the horns passed the hip, leaving a space wide enough for life to rush in and out again. But the conventional way, the safe way, was a lie. It was a compromise, and the goddess does not accept compromise. The air in the courtyard, even before the sun reached its zenith, was thick and sweet. A cloying mix of olive oil, sandalwood incense burning in the copper censers, and the dry metallic scent of fresh bull excrement mixed with salt from the sea breeze. It clung to the linen tunics we wore, making the fabric stick heavy against the skin. The stadium floor was pounded earth, reddish-brown clay mixed with fine sand, deliberately kept loose to cushion the inevitable fall. Every footprint left a shallow, temporary crater. I remember the sound of the crowd before they settled into their ritual silence. A low, humming anxiety, like a hive expecting disturbance. I stood in the shadowed entrance, the transition chamber that smelled strongly of sweat and cheap wine used for minor blessings. The light outside was blinding, a sharp, uncompromising glare reflecting off the whitewashed walls of the palace. It pressed down on the arena, making the colors of the frescoed walls seem impossibly vivid. The deep Aegean blue, the ochre yellow, the cinnabar red. My hands, they were the focus of my entire existence in those hours. They were rubbed raw, dusted with fine ash from the sacred fire to enhance the grip. They felt enormous, clumsy, yet simultaneously numb with anticipation. They were bare. No ropes, no hooks, no leather bands of distraction. Just the skin God gave me, ready to meet the skin of the beast. Then came the quiet. That profound ritualistic silence that meant the gate was opening. The chains clanked once, a terrible iron sound that cut through the humidity. He entered the stadium not running, but walking with a slow, deliberate arrogance. He was magnificent, a creature carved from black obsidian and rage. His hide shone like polished stone, catching the glare. He was larger than any we had worked with that season, not merely muscle, but mass. He was Gaia made manifest, terrifying and beautiful. The others moved first, the two apprentices who would serve as the distractors. They carried the traditional red cloths, snapping them sharply to incite the charge. They were graceful, quick, adhering perfectly to the established choreography. The bull reacted predictably, lowering his head, scraping the earth once with a massive foreleg, sending a plume of red dust into the air. I watched this familiar dance, but something had shifted inside me. The usual cleansing fear was absent. Instead, there was a cold, alien certainty. The conventional leap, the one I had perfected, felt small. Insufficient. It was a trick played on a beast, not a true communion with the divine. I realized, standing there in the suffocating heat, that the ritual was broken. We were appeasing the form, but ignoring the spirit. And if I wanted to survive, if our city was to survive the silent tremors I felt beneath the clay, I had to stop performing and start commanding. I took 3 slow steps out of the shadow and onto the blazing earth, tasting the dust instantly. I ignored the gasps from the periphery. I ignored the sudden sharp command of the head priest, now just a muffled irritation against the roar in my ears. I did not wait for the bull to pass the distraction. I walked directly into his path, and I stretched out my hands. They were empty. They were waiting. They were not offering a rope or a lure. They were offering surrender, which is the ultimate form of control. The dust cloud was not a shield. It was a curtain drawn back violently, revealing the true scale of the moment. The air fractured under the weight of his approach. I felt the reverberation rise through the solace of my feet, vibrating the bone structure in my ankles first, then traveling up the spine, settling into the base of my skull as a low, persistent thrumming. The scent hit me before the sound registered fully, a thick, wet musk, hot earth, and the faint, bitter tang of residual fear, not mine, but the ancient panic of the beast anticipating the violence of contact. He was a moving mountain of muscle, the color of wet obsidian where the sun caught his hide, but smeared with the pale, red clay of the practice pits. His head swung low, tracking the ground, not me. The horns, polished smooth by years of rubbing against rock, and the frantic touch of previous leapers, were not weapons to me. They were handles. They were the key. I focused on the breath leaving his wide, flared nostrils. It was humid, carrying the deep, vegetative smell of his last feeding. The sound was an ocean wave breaking, not a roar, but a massive, sustained inhalation, preparing for the final, catastrophic expenditure of energy. The distance closed from 5 lengths to 3, then 2. The human world vanished. The stands, the worried faces, the head priest's muffled fury all dissolved into a colorless blur at the edge of my vision. There was only the charging dark mass and the blinding yellow light of the sun directly overhead. In that final, impossible stretch of time, I did not pray for strength. I prayed for perfect alignment. I was not conquering the beast. I was agreeing with him. I was submitting to his speed while demanding his momentum. His eyes, they were wide, black, and utterly empty of malice, yet filled with unstoppable kinetic force. They were reflecting my own silhouette, tiny and distorted, in the moment before impact. I saw myself, a shadow puppet against the enormous canvas of his face. I shifted my weight not backward in preparation for defense, but forward, aggressively, into the path. This was the critical violation of physics the crowds never understood, the defiance that separates the dancer from the victim. To survive the charge, you must meet the charge. You must become part of the acceleration. I waited until the last moment, the absolute threshold where inertia and mass became overwhelming. I could feel the furnace heat radiating off his neck. I did not leap up, waiting for the lift. I reached out. My hands found their purchase simultaneously. Not on the polished tips, which would have meant certain death, but deep where the bone meets the skull, where the skin is thickest and the vibration is pure. I gripped the horn-base rough, warm bone beneath the thick skin, vibrating like a plucked, taut string. The force of the collision was not a blunt impact. It was the sudden, violent transfer of velocity. It emptied my lungs immediately, replacing the air with a blinding white pressure behind my eyes. My arms locked, absorbing the shock not through muscle, but through a lifetime of practiced, instantaneous yielding. I felt my feet leave the earth. I was weightless, for a fraction of a second, entirely dependent on the forward thrust of the animal. Pressed against his neck, my face inches from his straining shoulder. The world below became a streak of red clay and churning hooves. I was no longer standing in the arena. I was flying with the earth. I pulled myself inward, compressing my body against the curve of his back, using my own small weight as a ballast against his power. The roar of the beast finally became audible, a sound trapped deep in his chest, vibrating up through my palms. It was the sound of necessary exertion, not anger. The air smelled of copper now, of blood pulsing too fast. The movement was a blur of centrifugal force, spinning me rapidly around his center axis. My focus was singular: maintain the grip, wait for the perfect crest of his leap. This was the part of the ritual where the previous leapers failed. They used the rope as a point of leverage, but the rope was a lie. It was a barrier between the body and the divine motion. My hands were bare. There was no lie. There was only bone, skin, and the agreement of motion. I held my breath, counting the rhythm of his massive strides. 1, 2, 3. At the height of the third stride, when the bull's entire body was stretched long and parallel to the ground, suspended momentarily between gravity and his own speed, that was the moment of release. That was the window. I pulled myself up, dragging my torso over the slick, muscled curve of his shoulder. My skin burned instantly against the heated hide, a sharp, momentary pain that anchored me to the reality of the beast. I pushed off with my left hand, driving my weight upward and over the spine. I was riding the arc. The world tilted back to horizontal. The screaming of the crowd returned, distant and thin, like gnats buzzing above a feast. They were witnessing the impossible transfer the movement from front to back, the transition from opponent to passenger. My right foot hit the small of his back, planting firmly for the spring. I did not look down. If I looked down, I would see the earth rushing toward me, and I would fall into the panic of height. I looked forward, across the rising curve of his neck, towards the open space ahead. The bull was still running, still committed to the straight line of his charge. He had forgotten me. He was simply energy now. I waited for the precise zenith, the split second when the downward pull of gravity began to exceed the upward thrust of his leap. That moment is silent. It is entirely private. I launched myself backward, away from the momentum, a single sharp push using the residual power stored in the bull's spine. I aimed not for the ground, but for the space asterisk behind asterisk the bull, hoping to land in the vacuum created by his passing mass. I flew high, too high. The sun flashed past my eyes. For a terrifying instant, I saw the arena floor from the perspective of the sky, a tiny circle of red, surrounded by the dizzying height of the palace walls. Then the descent began. It was fast and uncontrolled. I was supposed to tuck, to roll, to land lightly on my shoulders, minimizing the impact. But the power of the bull had flung me wider than intended. I hit the ground hard. Not the soft, prepared earth near the barrier, but the compacted, clay-hard surface of the center ring. My shoulder struck first, absorbing the remaining kinetic energy with a sickening jolt that echoed through my jaw. I slid, the coarse sand and pebbles ripped at the skin of my back and arms. The dry dust, thick and suffocating, rose instantly, choking me, filling my mouth with the taste of ancient minerals and bile. I lay still, listening only to the frantic drumming of my own heart, waiting for the bull to turn back. I was blind and deafened by the dust cloud I had created. I tasted blood, hot and metallic, from where my teeth had clipped my tongue. The air was heavy, motionless. Then, through the ringing silence, I heard the sound that mattered most, the relentless thundering of the bull's hooves, receding into the distance, carrying his wild, spent energy away from me. He had not noticed my fall. He was gone. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, spitting out the grit. I saw the deep, raw abrasion running the length of my forearm. It was weeping red immediately, staining the white linen of my armband. My hands, the bare hands that had demanded control, were slick with sweat, dust, and the trace oils of the beast. They were shaking violently now that the task was complete. They were empty again. The surrounding noise returned, a sudden explosive wave of human sound that felt abrasive after the pure focus of the flight. I pulled myself to my feet, ignoring the sharp, persistent ache in my ribs. I had performed the ritual. I had survived the confrontation. But the victory was cold, tasting only of dust and the certainty that next time, the agreement might be broken. And next time, the ground would not yield. The attendants moved toward me now, their steps muffled by the thick layer of compressed sand. They were the silent mechanisms of the ritual, their faces masked by the ochre paint of devotion and the professional detachment of surgeons. They did not rush. Nothing in the Palace of Knossos ever rushed. Time here was measured not by the sun, but by the slow, grinding turn of cosmic cycles. I was supported, not comforted. Their hands, cool and dry, gripped my elbows. I felt the grit of the arena clinging to my sweat-damp skin, a fine, harsh film of earth and dried salt that felt shameful now that the danger had passed. They guided me toward the shadowed exit ramp, away from the blinding, screaming light of the central court. The transition was immediate and brutal. We slipped beneath the massive stone walls and into the damp, echoing corridors of the subterranean chambers. The air here was utterly different. It was heavy, cool, and carried the specific. mineral scent of aged copper and the perpetual perfume of cedar smoke trapped in the porous gypsum stone. It was the smell of the labyrinth itself, vast and uncaring. My mind refused to stop cataloging the micro-sensations. The way my right ankle resisted bending. The sound of their sandals scraping faintly on the polished floor, a sound swallowed instantly by the sheer volume of the space. The relief of the sudden cold on my lungs, followed by the immediate deep shiver of release. They led me to the cleansing chamber, a small, circular room cut deep into the bedrock. There was one basin of bronze, already filled with water, and low benches for the oil application. I stood in the center, a pillar of exhaustion and grime. The acolytes began to remove the thin, blood-flecked linen tunic. The cloth stuck stubbornly to the scrape marks on my shoulders and hips. The movement was agonizingly slow, a perverse prolonging of the discomfort. Once the tunic was gone, I was exposed to the cool air and the steady, neutral gaze of the attendants. They viewed the bruising and the minor cuts not as injuries, but as necessary stamps of passage, evidence. One of them approached the basin, lifting a heavy ceramic jug. The liquid inside was thick, yellow-green, and sluggish. It was the sacred oil pressed from the oldest olives, scented with iris root and saffron. It was supposed to heal. It was supposed to sanctify. The oil was lukewarm, strangely viscous. It did not feel like a cleanser. It felt like a sealant. They poured it first over my head, letting the sticky stream run down my scalp and face. It immediately captured the grit, creating muddy rivulets that traced paths through the fine dust coating my skin. It coated my eyelids and blurred my vision. I stood blind for a long moment, hearing only the rhythmic sloshing of the oil being worked into my shoulders and back. The smell was overpowering, rich, floral, and medicinal. It suffocated the lingering musk of the boule and the sharp tang of my own fear. They were working the tension out of the muscles, but the process was clinical, a necessary friction. They spoke in low, repetitive chants, but the words were Minoan, old and guttural, meaning nothing specific to me, the High Priestess. They were sounds meant to fill the vacuum of silence, not to convey meaning. I felt the oil being worked into the tendons of my wrists, the ones that had gripped the bull's horns for that impossible duration. They were raw, burning beneath the lubrication. I was being preserved, treated like a vase that had survived a long fall. I was being returned to the state of ritual purity, ready to carry the weight of the next requirement. But the oil felt heavy, not light. It pressed the exhaustion deeper into the marrow of the bone. When they finally guided me to the basin and began to rinse the oil away with cool water, the true dirt of the arena was revealed. The water turned immediately opaque, a swirling torrent of red earth, sweat, and the microscopic flakes of my own abraded skin. I watched it swirl down the drain hole, disappearing into the darkness beneath the palace foundations. That was the part that was spent. That was the effort that was gone. But the emptiness did not follow the filth. The emptiness remained within the cavity of my chest, chilled and absolute. I felt the smooth, cold surface of the ritual stone against my newly cleaned skin. The oil had done its work. The body was functional again. But the knowledge of the bull's power, that crushing, indifferent weight, had been absorbed. It was sealed inside me, beneath the layer of iris-scented oil, a new permanent layer of knowledge. I was a vessel restored. But the contents had been irrevocably altered. They presented the fresh tunic, woven of fine, unbleached linen. It was soft against the tender skin, a stark difference from the rough material of the arena. When I put it on, I felt the familiar weight of the office settle back upon my shoulders, heavier than the boule itself. The ritual was complete. The survival was confirmed. The solitude of the priestess began anew. I had faced the beast and survived the god. Now I had to survive the silence of the temple. The stone beneath my sandals felt strangely cool, almost hostile, after the heat-soaked earth of the arena. My steps were mechanical, traversing the prescribed route back toward the inner sanctum, where the air was eternally thick with the scent of dried lilac and pulverized cedar wood. It was a clean smell, a smell of absence and order, which now seemed to war fiercely with the residue clinging to my skin. I walked through the labyrinthine corridors. The torches were few here, casting elongated, unstable shadows that had nothing to do with the sun. They were shadows born of secrecy and the necessity of conserving oil. The silence was the worst kind of sound, the sound of expectation, of judgment waiting to descend, the sound of the world holding its breath until I performed the next required gesture. My hands, I kept them slightly apart from my body, flexing the fingers gently. They were still coated in a fine, invisible film, not the blood of the bull. That had been washed away quickly in the ritual basin outside the pit. This was something deeper. This was the oily residue of its massive life force. The sebum mixed with the dark sweat that had run down its flank just moments before I launched myself upward. I sat on the cold marble slab reserved for the High Priestess, beneath the silent gaze of the clay figures of the Earth Mother. I pressed my palms together, rubbing them slowly, trying to scrape the memory away. The rough linen of the tunic provided no distraction. I could still feel the bristling texture of the bull's short, dark hair. It was a texture of utter density, a physical certainty that overshadowed the frail certainty of my own life. I remembered the instant my fingers gripped the ridge of its shoulder muscle, the sheer heat radiating upward, a furnace of flesh and intent. That heat, I realized, was the only divinity I truly trusted. Not the god in the sky, but the terrestrial, raging god contained within that hide. I closed my eyes, and the darkness was not empty. It was filled with the reverberation of its snorting breath, an inhalation so deep it seemed to pull the very dust from the air. It was filled with the specific, pungent smell of its diet-dried grass and wet earth, metabolized into pure, violent power. The priests and acolytes moved around me, preparing the evening libations, their movements hushed and respectful. They saw only the survivor, the vessel returned to its shelf, cleansed and functional. They did not see the terror that still vibrated in my tendons, or the obsessive need to recall the exact shape of the bull's neck when it arched in fury. It was an addictive memory. The moment before the leap, when the bull's eye rolled back and saw only the shadow of the human form approaching. The moment it braced for the impact, recognizing me not as a predator, but as a necessary component of its own ritual violence. We were not enemies. We were partners in the sacred architecture of trauma. I lifted my hand toward a flickering oil lamp, examining the skin. There was no visible trace. The dust was gone. The sweat had evaporated. But the tactile memory of that immense, living weight beneath my hands remained, branded into the nerve endings, a cold, persistent pressure against the bone. I wondered if I would ever touch anything else again without feeling the ghost of the bull's muscle underneath it. I hoped not. That feeling was the only true thing I had ever held. It was the only tangible proof that my existence was real, heavy, and worth the risk. I carried the weight of him inside the walls of the palace. The silence of the inner courts was a violent shock after the roar of the sand pit. The stone corridors were cool, absorbing the heat that still radiated off my skin like steam. I listened to the sound of my own sandals scraping on the polished gypsum floor. It was a thin, brittle sound. Everything around me felt thin and brittle. The air in the sanctuary always smelled of old ritual, dried saffron flowers pressed flat against the walls, the cold metallic tongue of the offering basins, and the dust of crushed lapis lazily mixed into the paint. When I breathed it in, it felt too light, insufficient. It did not have the density of the arena air, thick with blood and fear and the wet odor of hide. That air had weight. This air here was merely atmosphere. I walked past the frescoes. The depictions of the horns, massive and clean, painted in precise ochre and hematite. They were beautiful lies. They lacked the texture, the deep, living heat that pulsed just beneath the surface of the beast's skin. The artists, skilled as they were, could only capture the shape. They missed the inertia. They missed the moment the muscle twitched under your grip, refusing to be contained by a mere painting. I went straight to the cleansing room, not for purification, but for solitude. I stood under the spout where the cold water ran from the cistern. It was ice against the raw places on my shoulders. I watched the dust wash away, swirling down the drain, the last visible evidence of the encounter. I held my hands out. They were shaking slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the memory of gripping. I closed my eyes and tried to recall the specific resistance of the neck muscle as I launched myself up. It was like trying to hold smoke. The memory was already dissolving into myth, into the grand, clean narrative the priests would now begin to weave for the city. But my body remembered. The pads of my fingers were permanently imprinted with the sensation of coarse hair giving way to firm, hot flesh. I pressed my palm flat against the cool, damp marble of the wall. The marble was smooth, inert, final. It was trustworthy in its cold permanence, but it had no life. It offered no resistance. The bull was chaos given form. The bull was a universe of muscle flexing against my will. And in that brief, suspended moment, when I was airborne, transitioning from his back to the ground, I realized that the true ritual was not the jump itself. It was the moment immediately afterward, when everything else in the world became irrelevant. Every conversation, every political maneuvering, every careful arrangement of jewels or clay pots, it all fell away. Only the echo of his breath remained. A deep, wet roar that vibrated the very foundation of the earth. I needed that sound. I needed that weight. Without it, I was simply a shadow moving across a painted wall, unreal, easily erased by the next brushstroke of history. I spent the next hour simply tracing the lines on my own palms, searching for the abrasion, the tiny bruise that proved I had not merely dreamed the density of life. I found a small fissure in the skin near my thumb, where the friction had been too great. I touched it carefully. It stung. This tiny, painful tear was my relic, my undeniable proof of gravity. I would not let the softness of the temple erase it. I would not let the clean white halls diminish the dark truth of what I had held. I ran my tongue across the split skin. The taste of salt and iron was the last true flavor remaining from the arena. The taste of my own necessity. The priests would soon come looking for me, carrying clean linen and speaking of divine favor and the necessary maintenance of order. They would want to dress me in the silks that made the body disappear. I would refuse. I needed to feel the chill of the marble against my bare forearm for as long as possible, reminding myself of the difference between the coldness of stone and the vibrant heat of the beast. One was forever silent. The other, though gone from the pit, still screamed inside the hollow of my chest. I had traded the ease of the temple for that scream. It was a fair exchange. I carried the scent of the arena with me always. It was a fine reddish powder, composed of pulverized clay and sun-baked earth, clinging to the deepest folds of my robes long after the washing rituals. But mixed within that earth were metallic flakes, the dried sweat and microscopic fragments of iron from the charging hooves. When I knelt in the temple, attempting to meditate on the calm of the sea, my nostrils were still filled with that copper tongue, that deep, hot smell of living force meeting friction. The memory was not visual. The image of the beast charging was too fast, too blurred by velocity to hold any detail. The memory was purely tactile. It was the texture beneath my fingertips that obsessed me in the quiet darkness of the sanctuary. People who only watched from the terraces imagined the bull's hide as smooth and dark, an impenetrable wall of muscle. It was not. Up close, when you had pressed your weight into it, it was like coarse felt, dense and fiercely hot, slightly slick with the internal furnace of its rage. The hair was stiff, angled sharply against the direction of the leap, designed to resist any grip. My hand had to find that fraction of a second when the skin was stretched tautest over the curve of the shoulder blade, just before the pivot, just as the muscles coiled for the final violent extension. That moment of perfect tension was the only grip allowed. Anything softer, anything looser, and you would slide down the massive flank and be trampled into the red dust like a broken offering. When I caught the horns, the world did not explode. It went profoundly silent. It wasn't a sudden stop, but a deep muting, as if the air itself had thickened into warm, heavy honey. My breath ceased. I remember the sheer, astronomical weight of the neck, the immense, living tonnage that I had to redirect using only the leverage of my hips and the perfect placement of my hands. It was not strength that saved us. Strength failed immediately against that mass. It was knowing exactly where the mass wanted to go and helping it get there, but only after I was already launched upward. It was the absolute submission to the beast's trajectory, matched by the instantaneous refusal to be crushed by it. I felt the deep rumble of its bellowing, not in my ears, but vibrating within the very bones of my wrists, a sound so pure and low it felt like the core rhythm of the earth itself. That sound was the heartbeat of the divine. and I was holding it pressed against my skin for the span of 3 breaths. I learned to distinguish the smell of the first jump from the last. The first was dominated by fear, sharp and acrid, mixed with the freshness of the morning dew still clinging to the straw bedding. The last was heavy, saturated with fatigue and the sweet, mineral tang of deep muscle exhaustion. By the end, I was wrestling not just the bull, but the very notion of gravity and the draining persistence of the sun. My body became a tool for the gods, finely tuned, perfectly disposable. They often asked me how I managed the landing, the backward flip that must conclude the act, the moment of returning to the ground. That was the easy part. Gravity, after all, is predictable. The ground is always there. It is solid. The unpredictable part, the truly terrifying part, was the instant after the jump, when I had already rolled free, and I had to stand and turn back to face the animal that had just borne me. That was the moment of judgment. Had I shown the necessary respect for its power? Had I manipulated its sacred rage with the required humility? The bull would stand there, chest heaving, steam rising from its nostrils in thin, white plumes against the searing blue of the sky. Its eyes, still wild, would lock onto mine. For that brief, timeless moment, there was no priestess and no ritual. There was only the animal and the consciousness that had dared to touch it. We would breathe the same air, thick with heat and copper. And then slowly it would drop its immense head, acknowledging the end of the dance. It was a silence that consumed the roar of the crowd, leaving only the sound of heavy panting and the slow drip of sweat from my brow onto the cooling earth. This silence, this specific gravity between us, was the reward I craved. It was colder than the marble of the temple floor, but infinitely more honest. The silence never lasted long enough. The attendants, draped in saffron and heavy linen, would approach with practiced slowness, their eyes fixed on my wounds as if measuring the favor of the Earth Mother by the depth of the abrasions. They did not touch me immediately. The transition required reverence, a slow peeling away of the ritual skin. I was still saturated with the massive heat of the bull, the lingering copper tongue of his breath on my collarbone. The exhaustion that followed was not merely the depletion of muscle fibers, but the sudden emptying of the divine current, leaving the vessels of my veins brittle and dry. I would stand there, perhaps for 30 heartbeats, feeling the grit of the arena dust ground deep into the solace of my feet, adhering to the surface of the wounds that had not yet chosen to bleed freely. My hands, they were the key, the fulcrum. Even after the adrenaline subsided, a slight tremor persisted, a fine, residual vibration that spoke of the immense force I had just briefly contained. I would turn them over, palms up, examining the creases where the rough hide had dragged, where the sheer friction had burned away the top layer of skin. It was a clean, sharp pain, unlike the dull ache of a muscle tear. This pain was a signature, proof of contact. They led me then across the scorching sand toward the cool, shadowed entry arch of the labyrinth. The shift in temperature was violent from the baked, brilliant glare outside to the damp, mineral chill of the stone corridor. This was the true moment of confession, when the public gaze was removed and I was left alone with the physical truth of the deception. For the crowd saw transcendence, a woman who danced with death and emerged whole. But I knew the precise measurement of the risk. I knew the millisecond of luck that separated the triumphant leap from the sickening crunch of bone against horn. I was not a goddess. I was a vessel of timing and specific gravity, a finely tuned instrument of flesh trained to exploit the limits of bovine motion. In the bathing chamber, the acolytes would wash the arena away. The water, infused with expensive salts and oil, cinnamon, and myrrh, turned immediately cloudy, flushing the residue of the spectacle. I hated the smell of the perfume attempting to mask the raw, earthy scent of the Minoans that still clung to my hair and skin. I preferred the copper. I preferred the dust. They were the badges of the brief reality I had inhabited. I would lie submerged in the cold water, listening to the heavy, echoing silence of the inner palace, feeling the slow pulse of my own blood beneath the cooling surface of the water. This was where the legacy was forged, not in the roar, but in the meticulous, lonely inventory of every bruise and ache. The weight of the horns, the sheer volume of the bull's body passing beneath me, it was all recorded, stamped onto the fibers of my memory. I transcribed the force onto my own body, ensuring the power remained mine, and not merely the beast's. I kept the ritual scars hidden beneath the thick, embroidered linens required of my station. They were maps of failure and near failure, delicate traceries of the moments the Earth Mother had chosen not to reclaim me. The most insidious of all was the lingering phantom weight in my wrists. It felt like 2 rings of cold iron pressing constantly just above the bone, reminding me how thin the skin was, how easily the structure could give way. I learned to interpret the way the bronze lamplight fell upon the polished floor of my private chambers. I learned to measure time not by the sun, but by the rate at which the muscle spasms in my calves would subside. And I waited for the next cycle, the next time the arena gates would open. And I would be required to prove that the spirit inhabiting this fragile envelope of skin was worthy of the great, dumb power of the bull. This waiting was the true penance. It was the knowledge that I had tasted the absolute freedom of physical power, and that I would inevitably have to risk everything again just to feel the cold, honest silence one more time. The knowledge was the cold, honest silence of the waiting. And then the waiting was broken. It was broken by the scrape of the chain across the limestone gate, a sound that always managed to silence the thousands gathered before the beast was even visible. This final bull was black. Not merely dark, but absorbing all available light, its coat glistening with the sweat of its own immense heat. It was heavier than the others, its shoulders like sloping mountains, and its eyes held no panic, only a deep geological disinterest. I stepped onto the sand. The sun was directly overhead, burning the dust and turning the air into a shimmering, suffocating sheet. This time, I did not think of the mother nor the harvest. I only thought of the angle of my own wrist, and the precise moment my weight must shift. The charge was not a rush. It was a slow, inevitable tide of muscle. I felt the vibration through the solace of my feet before the sound reached my ears. The ground thrummed with a heavy, wet rhythm, like a heart too large for the world. I moved forward to meet it. This was the ultimate trespass. Not waiting for the momentum to carry me, but actively seeking the collision. The horns came. They were wider set than usual, catching the light like polished obsidian. I felt the hot, sour wind of its exhalation wash over my face, carrying the scent of mastic trees and terror. I reached. I did not grab its horn as I had been taught. I pushed my open palm directly against the hard bone ridge above its eye socket. It was a point of contact that shattered all previous instruction. It was not a leap. It was a pivot. I used the sheer, horrifying force of its own charge to torque my body upward and over. The world spun into a blur of black hide, blinding sunlight, and grit. For one fractional, eternal moment, I was weightless. I was suspended in the space above death, utterly free of gravity and consequence. It was the purest moment of being I had ever known. Then came the return. The landing was a disaster. I did not execute the perfect roll. My left foot caught the edge of the pit, and the impact traveled straight up my leg, compressing my spine and driving the air from my lungs in a sharp, tearing gasp. The world did not go black, but dull, muffled. I tasted iron and dust. I stood instantly. My training demanded it. The priestess must never stumble, never show the wound. But the pain was a new entity. It was not the sharp, manageable fire of torn muscle. It was a deep, sickening throb that settled in the base of my skull and promised permanence. I raised my arms, a required gesture of triumph over the inert beast that now stood panting, confused, several yards away. The roar of the crowd was immediate and deafening. They saw the successful leap, the perfect completion of the cycle. They saw the manifestation of the mother's favor. They did not see the slight tremor in my left hand, the way I had to shift my weight imperceptibly to keep pressure off the hip that felt like shattered glass. I walked slowly out of the arena, maintaining the required slow, deliberate pace. I heard the singing begin, the ritual chants of victory and continuation. But the chants were hollow. They were sounds for the city, for the people who needed the myth to sustain their own soft lives. When the doors to the sanctuary closed behind me, the cold stone absorbed the noise, leaving only the sound of my own shallow breathing. The immediate days were a blur of unguents, enforced stillness, and the cloying sweetness of honey wine meant to dull the physical truth. I lay on the ritual slab, and the great silence returned, heavier this time, less welcomed. I had achieved the impossible. I had faced the ultimate power and walked away, apparently whole. But the body remembers the transaction. My spine, once a flawless rod of intention, was now a fragile stack of regrets. The strength that had been my greatest offering, the raw, absolute power to defy the earth, was gone, replaced by a constant low-grade ache that never truly left me. It settled in the mornings, sharp and demanding, and eased only slightly by the time the evening fires were lit. They came to me, the supplicants, the grateful citizens. They knelt before me, touching the hem of my robe, speaking of divine grace and my legendary strength. They saw the symbol. They saw the enduring power of the Minoan spirit embodied in my still frame. I looked at them, and I saw only their profound blindness. They celebrated a body that was now nothing more than a carefully maintained ruin. I was alive, yes, but only in the most brittle sense. I had traded the soft, slow promise of old age for one incandescent, terrible instant of freedom. The bull did not kill me, but the triumph did. I became the shadow of the priestess, condemned to live forever within the confines of the story I had created. My voice, once used to command the cycles of the court, became low, measured, incapable of true laughter or sudden outcry, because any sharp movement reminded me of the fragile plates holding my damaged self together. They call me the priestess who dared, but I am merely the woman who is perpetually cold, whose joints predict the weather with painful accuracy. I sit now, years later, watching the dust motes drift in the sunbeams of the sanctuary chamber. I smell the dry incense and the stale oil. I wait for nothing new. The great beast is replaced every few seasons, a fresh, ignorant supply of muscle and rage. The leap continues, performed now by younger hands, trained on the flawed memory of my impossible technique. They strive for the grace I once possessed. They strive for the silence I once coveted. They will learn in time that the silence you earn from the bull is not peace. It is merely the absence of the future. It is the cold, hard certainty that the greatest fear is not death, but having nothing left to risk. And the pain, the terrible, meticulous, daily pain, is the only proof that the moment ever happened at all. It is the only thing left that is truly mine.